Good morning, everybody. How we doing? It is a Thursday morning here in Minnesota, in the lower southeast corner, Elgin, Minnesota. We're still holding on here in the cafe. It's slow, but the DJ work seems to be helping me stay afloat. I got a meeting this weekend with another potential bar to do what I do in, so let's hope that goes well. Hope everyone's doing well and surviving out there. The jazz community is such a fun place to be a part of, whether it's seeing jazz at local venues or collecting the old records. There's such a need to keep pushing this art form, but doing it so that people want to be a part of it. It's an accessible art form that's often perceived as being inaccessible. And I'm not going to go down that road with people talking about, the avant-garde and free jazz and all that stuff. Because I do like a lot of that stuff. But again, it's like a beer connoisseur or a wine sommelier. You come to complex Cabernets after some time developing your palate. You come to a triple IPA or an Imperial Stout after years of drinking lagers and pilsners and brown ales. You develop that palate, you develop that discernment. You find the balance between the body and the malt and the hops and the finish, and you recognize what a good beer should taste like in each particular style. And so many of these experts out there are just being proponents of a very advanced form of jazz that doesn't really have access points for the novice. And if one was to look for a great access point for a beginner, and I've seen these lists put out there on social media endless times, I would argue that Dexter Gordon is one of those great access points. Dexter's just a fantastic player. He's a great tenor saxophonist. He comes from an old school. His influences are rooted deeply in Coleman Hawkins, deeply in Lester Young, deeply in Ben Webster. His contemporary is really Illinois Jacquet. Those two guys were kind of that mid-era 40s into the 50s during the war era guys. Teddy Charles. There's a lot of guys. Not Teddy Charles, Teddy Edwards, sorry. Dexter was a West Coast guy. And coming up during the bebop era, Parker had gone out west with Dizzy at one point. I think Parker came back again a second time. Dexter was influenced by Parker and bebop, but he always stayed more rooted in the R&B side of things. But he certainly could definitely blow. He played a lot with Wardell Gray, who came to a tragic end in the deserts of Las Vegas. Apparently the mafia took him out, the mob. There's some ambiguity as to what Wardell Gray's real endings were, but I've even read that he was beheaded by the mob. But I don't remember if that was accurate or not. In the comments, clear up for me. But I remember there's an uncertainty as to his end. But Wardell disappeared off the scene, and him and Dexter used to have these great battles on Central Avenue in Los Angeles. And it was a great scene on the West Coast happening that was very detached from what was happening on the East Coast. This wasn't the days of the internet. This wasn't the days of a lot of plane travel. A train trip across country was a 3, 4, 5 day journey. The automobile industry was still very much in its infancy. And even more so, the auto route industry. There was no interstates in the 40s. This was a post-war development. And so cross-country communication was very minimal. What was happening on the East Coast took a while to trickle out to the West Coast. What was happening on the West Coast took a while to be heard on the East Coast. And this, of course, affected the record industry as well. These guys who are making 78s, they're ability to distribute nationwide was limited to only the most powerful record labels. They had that power, and it could be nationwide, RCA, Victor, Gramophone, the Columbia record industry. Those guys had that kind of pull, but your average small label had a very regional distribution. And the scene that was developing on the West Coast with Hampton Hawes and guys like Teddy Charles, Teddy Edwards, and Dexter Gordon, it was a very vibrant scene located in the heart of the black neighborhoods in Los Angeles on Central Avenue. And this was an upwardly mobile Central Avenue. This was a neighborhood that had, for a black neighborhood, prosperity and businesses and wealth and black hotels and black bars. And it was one that was subjugated by white Los Angeles and really driven back underground into poverty. And the affluent South Central of the 20s, 30s, 40s became the impoverished South Central of the NWA, Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, 80s. I mean, it was really a different landscape by that time. Black entrepreneurship has always been very discouraged. We don't want a black, upwardly mobile America because we always need that group to look down upon as poor white Americans. And racism has been at the fundamental core of so much of the power structure within this country. And so much of the division and classism is relying on a lot of the tenets of racism to be as firmly implanted as it is. And so you had these guys on the West Coast with opportunity to play and venues to play in. And along Central Avenue there was a dozen places where guys could book residencies and play. And it was a bit like 52nd Street on the East Coast there for a while, where it was just lots of venues, lots of opportunity, lots of talent. And of course it's a very different talent than the East Coast, a bit of a different sound. And this is not the same scene as the great West Coast cool players that were popping up and coming along at that same time. That being said, the West Coast cool had some fantastic players, and the West Coast cool was mostly white cats. Your Chet Bakers, your Jerry Mulligans. I mean, all these great players that were coming up doing things at Pacific Records and Contemporary Records, and a lot of it was very fantastic. And I was playing at my gig last Sunday, a 10-inch from Bethlehem, who opened up a West Coast office. And it was led by the great bass player, Max Bennett. It's got the zebras on the cover. I can't think of the name of it. It's a weird name for the album. And it's got just an incredible lineup on it with Charlie Mariano, Stu Williamson, Claude Williamson, Stan Levy, Frank Rosalino. And I mean, this is as close to hard bop as White Cats ever blew. This was some fantastic up-tempo, dynamic, fiery. I mean, it swings hard. It's really some fantastic stuff that you can tell how much they were listening to the Jazz Messengers and Art Blakey, how much they were hearing what Clifford Brown and Max Roach were doing out of Chicago. And of course, Clifford Brown had spent some time on the West Coast as well. And Clifford single-handedly was kind of changing the code. Clifford was so melodically centered and so not driven by just a drug high that he kind of single-handedly codifies bebop into hard bop. It's going to be more melodic. It's going to be more swinging. It's going to be more danceable. And it's not the danceable of the swing era, of course, but it's still very much a different sound, which is why it got a new name, hard bop. And the cool bop was my name for the white West Coast cats that were blowing hard and trying to do that stuff. And all the white cats will tell you, if you read the liner notes, who they were listening to. I mean, it's all was a very clear one-to-one relationship of these East Coast black guys innovating and the white West Coast cats. And of course, a lot of these white West Coast white cats came from the East Coast, Philadelphia and Newark, and ended up out on the West Coast. But there was jobs there. There was the Hollywood studios there. There was the television studios there. There was lots of work for white cats especially. And of course, the black cats were pretty much the cats that were somewhat ended up in Los Angeles in the service industry, that were musicians that created their own scene. And Dexter is just a luminary in that scene. He's a beautifully toned player. If you listen to him, Dexter plays a ballad with the best of them. Again, a lot of Coleman, a lot of Lester. Not quite the breathiness of Ben Webster, but those three guys are always at the root of all the great tenor players that exist. And Dexter, of course, had drug problems. Heroin was dropped in all the black neighborhoods by the CIA, FBI, and the subversion of black neighborhoods and the poverty and the opportunity that drugs provided pretty much left a dead-end road for a lot of these guys. And Dexter has his career interrupted several times by prison stints. And he comes back on the scene in 55, does a recording for Bethlehem that's fantastic, that great recording for a doom tone, Tall and Cool, I think it's called, and may not be right, but it's a great session with the classic Dexter smoking on the cover. Everybody smoked in those days. And those two records kind of gave indication of where Dexter was heading and how he was grafting himself into that new small band scene and really hearing the forefathers, but also kind of creating his own lane going forward. But it's not until the 60s, after a second stint in prison, where he comes back and does a rather nondescript title for New Jazz, which is Riverside, or in Keep News. But then he gets signed to Blue Note. And Alfred and Frank Lyon, Frank Wolf and Alfred Lyon, Al Lyon, they don't really sign the old guard a whole lot. They didn't bring in the Coleman Hawkins and the Lester Youngs and the Illinois Jack Cats and that was what Norman Granz was doing. Norman Granz did that consistently. And even Prestige with their Moodsville and Swingsville, they were willing to bring in old guard and record those guys because they were legends and needed to be documented. Because remember, a lot of the guys from that 30s, 40s era, what they recorded was in big bands with big swing leaders, and their names often were in obscurity somewhere, maybe on the label of the record. They would list the band sometimes, but I mean, a lot of times those bands were quite anonymous, and these records of that era didn't have jacket covers, so you didn't have liner notes in the back, you didn't have bands listed on the back. So a lot of the great talent of that era, especially the black talent, lives in great obscurity. These guys weren't getting in the readers' polls, Playboy and Downbeat. They didn't know most of this black talent. It was very obscure, very minimal, very minimalized to the margins, even though they were the innovators. And so you have some labels. I mean, even Riverside or Keep News, he did some of that stuff especially with his Jazzland imprint. He would give those guys sessions to document. Blue Note wasn't really doing that. Blue Note was really firmly entrenched in the sounds of the hard bop new thing happening on the East Coast. And this is, of course, once the LP era dawns. The 10-inch era, Blue Note's really a sail without a wind. They're doing all kinds of different things, from Gil Melly to, all the early boogie-woogie piano players. Blue Note's really a very diverse palette in the late 40s, early 50s. But it's really the dawning of the LP era where Blue Note starts to find its lane. And instead of recording, even those Monk titles for Blue Note in the early 50s and the Miles titles, they're really not connected to the body of what Blue Note became to be about. And so when Blue Note really starts to become Blue Note in 56, with those great Art Blakey, Horace Silver sessions, all the guys that were that Jazz Messenger alumni group, from Donald Byrd to Hank Bowman to Lee Morgan to Curtis Fuller, Sonny Clark. There was just so much burgeoning, new, aggressive tonality that was Blue Note's thing. And they didn't really venture out of that lane. They had young John Coltrane in 56 and 7. It's just a really interesting time at Blue Note. But looking back into the past wasn't really what their focus was. But when Dexter gets out of jail that second time in 60, 61, and he's available, Al and Frank go out of their comfort lane and they sign Dexter. And his maturity and his tonality, the closest thing Blue Note had to it before this was probably Ike Quebec, who was also a tenor player who lived very much in that same Ben Webster, Coleman Hawkins, Lester Young vein. And Ike he had a hard time as an A&R guy for Blue Note, putting sessions together, putting sidemen together, helping organize these sessions. He had a hard time recording his own stuff. And if you look at the legacy of Ike Quebec, most of his early work was done as 45s that were issued for jukeboxes because his sound was so more R&B, soul-driven, and not the hard bop sound. And it took a lot of arm twisting for him to get those recording sessions, Heavy Soul and It Might As Well Be Spring. Those Ike Quebec records are absolutely gorgeous. Some of the most beautiful records on the Blue Note catalog. And I think it probably opens the door to some degree for Dexter to come in and do what he does here. And he gets to play a lot with young cats. I mean, he's playing with Bobby Hutcherson, Barry Harris, Bob Cranshaw, and Billy Higgins. And this is what we're listening to here. And this is probably his 4th or 5th Blue Note record. And I played it a lot yesterday. And Hutcherson's fantastic on this and very young and vibrant. And Hutcherson could be quite avant-garde at times, but here he's playing very much in the honor of the legend that he's playing with. Harris was a young Detroit piano player, fiery and quite nimble. And Cranshaw and Higgins were, of course, great session drummers and bass players that ended up on a lot of Blue Note recordings. Great cover, great Blue Note legacy recording. Blue Note number 4204. And so he's coming along pretty midstream in the Blue Note story. And Dexter's not going to be long for America. He's going to do some time in Europe and recognize that, oh, freedom tastes kind of nice. Freedom is a wonderful thing. And he ends up spending a lot of his later years in Europe. And recording for Steeplechase and living in Denmark. And all those records are really fantastic. And they'll come along to you for a fraction of what the Blue Notes will. But this Getting Around record, excuse me, is an absolutely beautiful record. It's an absolutely gorgeous sound, gorgeous tonality, a really mature player, and really something that's quite out of the norm for what the Blue Note canon had to represent. And I think right before Getting Around was this record. And this one I think was actually recorded on tour in Denmark, in Europe. And you have Niels Henning Orsted, the bass player, the Danish bass player, along with Donald Byrd, who was also on tour in Denmark. And I can't remember if Dexter was on tour and recorded this there, or if he'd actually already moved there, meaning that this would have been recorded before he left for Europe and just didn't come out till afterwards. I don't remember that. But obviously, Art Taylor, Donald Byrd, Kenny Drew, those guys were on tour in Denmark, and they line up Dexter to record this session with the Danish bass player. And One Flight Up is a wonderful record, great cover. I mean, just the moody, somber tonality of that is just wonderful. And Dexter was like 6'5", just a tall drink of water. Big, smiling, engaging fella. And when he came back in the 80s, he was one of the few guys that went to Europe who was able to have a real resurgence when he came home. And he came home in the early 80s when jazz was really being marginalized. And a lot of the jazz that was out there was the Kenny G, really light, fluffy elevator remix shit that was soulless and without any compass. And he came back and played in New York triumphantly and had a real return and recorded some really good sessions of trad jazz in the 80s. But getting back to One Flight Up, really great record. And the song Tanya, which takes up all of side one, if I remember. Yeah, it's all side one. The track Tanya, it's 18 minutes long. It's just a wonderful R&B infused, grooving, hard driving track. I'll play a little bit of it here. you can just hear from the opening refrain the vibe of this. It's just fantastic feel. It's all vibe, it's all power and swing, and it just moves along. Donald Byrd, of course, Detroit native, a powerful ambassador of jazz in his own lane. And Dexter and Donald really are cohesive on this recording. And Donald always had a lot of R&B to his sound as well. Donald never went too far down that avant-garde free lane. He always stayed fairly rooted in, and you'll see with his 70s recordings with the Blackbirds and his own recordings in the 70s how R&B Donald was. I mean, I've talked many times about his records with the Mizell Brothers, Places and Spaces I've Been. I mean, those records, man, what's the other one from? Stepping Into Tomorrow. Those two records are two of my favorite records in the 70s. And they're very 70s. I mean, they're very that lane of production and sound. But Donald was a fantastic player. And this is a really great example of Blue Note and what their lanes were. And they dabbled in the avant-garde, they dabbled in the free sound, but they never really went too far down that rabbit hole. Alfred and Frank always wanted to have a groove. They wanted to be able to, I mean, there's many guys who will talk about how when they were in there, if they couldn't tap their feet, they wanted another take. They wanted to feel a vibe. And so this is just great Blue Note stuff that really encapsulates that mid-60s sound. And it really has a lot of echoes of Central Avenue and the hard driving, swinging, modern but yet traditional sounds of what was happening along Central Avenue in the 40s and the 50s. So Dexter's a great legend that deserves, there he is, man, and he's a bridge between those three early greats and your Sonny Rollins and your John Coltrane's. I mean, Dexter's that in-between tissue that connects those generations. And we talked a lot about Illinois Jack Kett in my last episode. Dexter is that other guy in that lane of the war years into the bop years on the tenor that was really driving home a great full tone sound, not being overwhelmed by the trends and all the new things happening. He was just doing what he did, which is always what. Ooh, I mean, there's a little Ben Webster right there with that little earthy, breathy sound that he just uttered. So one of my favorite records ever is One Flight Up, and that Getting Around record, man, it's just gorgeous. And there's a couple of ballads on this that are just great examples of what Dexter's sound is like. The flies in here are kind of bad right now. So Dexter Gordon, a guy you got to dig into. He's fabulous. He is the heart of the blues, the heart of the jazz, the heart of the swing, and one of the great legends that can't be overlooked. So check out Dexter Gordon if you don't know him well enough. And I think he does 6 records for Blue Note in that 60s era, and they're all worth having. And they all have great covers too. So love your Dexter, love your Blue Note. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't. We always appreciate your support. Hit that like button. And if you want to support the channel, Patreon is always there for you. PayPal, we appreciate that. Even Google Super Thanks through YouTube. It's all appreciated. We're doing our best to keep this all going and staying alive. I've had a lot of moving pieces lately. The DJing's been picking up steam, which is taken away from my time to make episodes. I'm always like pulling sets together and listening to records, and I'm in a very different lane when I'm DJing. I'm always listening to stuff that I'm like, oh, this will have people enjoy that. And I'm not just playing jazz, I'm playing blues, I'm playing soul, I'm playing reggae, I'm playing some elements of classic rock and 80s rock and new wave and a little bit of hip hop sprinkled in there just to kind of connect the tissue. And then of course you got your Bruno Mars and your Adeles and your Amy Winehouses. So there's this 7 decades of music that I'm mixing together in this milieu, this stew of modern music that's all rooted in jazz and all rooted in the blues. and how black all of it is. And it isn't about skin color. It's not about tonality of skin. It's about overcoming oppression. And that's what soul comes from. And that's what made black music what it was. It was this need to be free, this need to be celebrating life in spite of sorrow, that made it so connective, that made it so alluring. Even to the ruling class, they're like, man, what are these brothers coming up with? What is this music? Why has it got so much spirit, so much love, so much passion, so much sexuality? Because sexuality on a lot of levels was the bipartisan member of spirituality. And that sexuality was a form of freedom that the wealth that a lot of us take for granted was never accessible to them. So sexual freedom, sexual ecstasy was a form of ecstasy in heaven that was attainable to them. So they lived very much in that sexual pulse. And this stuff always has that. I mean, that's part of the magic of what black R&B was about, was that sexual pulse. And the duality of spirit and sex is alive throughout all black music. I mean, that's part of its magic, is that alluring sound of Ellington going, ooh, that's sensual. That's the scent of a woman. And that's part of the power. And so I love the music, feel the power within it, feel the way it can enrich your life. And I just appreciate you all and look forward to your comments. May it enrich you and be with you. My name is Dan, the Jazz Shepherd. I appreciate you all. We'll talk to you all soon. Have a great day. Peace.